On this November evening, Margaret Wolf sat in her kitchen in Freiburg and watched the first raindrops splattering against the window pane. At 47, she had learned that life rarely turned out the way you imagined it would. It had been 2 years since her divorce, and although she had told herself at the time that it would be a liberation, the silence in her apartment sometimes felt oppressive. Her ex-husband had found a younger woman, a colleague from his law firm, and was now living the life they should have had together. Margaret remained with her job as a nurse at the university hospital, with her routines and with a void she couldn't name. Her daughter Lena was 23 and had recently moved into her first apartment in Munich. She worked there as a graphic designer and only spoke to her mother on the phone sporadically. Margaret understood that. Young people had to go their own way. Still, it hurt when she came home in the evening and there was no one there to talk to about her day. Her colleagues at the hospital were friendly, but after their shifts, everyone went their separate ways. Friendships from earlier years had fallen dormant with marriage. Margaret had focused so much on her family that she had forgotten to live for herself. That evening, as the rain outside grew heavier, she opened the dating app on her smartphone once again. A colleague had told her about it, almost shyly, as if it was something forbidden. "It's not what you think," Sabine had said. "There are definitely interesting people there. You just have to be careful." Margaret had initially dismissed the idea. A dating app at 47? It seemed ridiculous to her. But the loneliness had been stronger than her pride. She had created a profile, uploaded a neutral photo of herself smiling, and written a few lines about herself. Nothing exciting, nothing desperate. The first messages she received were disappointing. Men who only gave superficial compliments or asked to meet up right away without really being interested in her. Margaret was about to delete the app when a message arrived from a man named Philipp Hartmann. His profile picture showed a handsome man in his mid-40s with dark hair and a warm smile. He didn't write the usual platitudes. Instead, he asked a question about one of the books Margareta had mentioned in her profile. It was a small gesture, but it showed that he had actually taken the time to read her profile. She replied to him, cautiously at first, but his answers were thoughtful and interesting. Philip said he worked in event management, traveled a lot, and enjoyed meeting new people. He wrote about his passion for sailing, about the freedom on the water, and how much he appreciated leaving everyday life behind. Margaret found his words fascinating. Her own life was so structured, so predictable. The idea of just setting sail and feeling the wind seemed like a fantasy from another life. The conversations between them developed over several weeks. Philippe was never pushy, but he showed interest. He asked about her day, her work at the hospital, her thoughts and feelings. Margaret began to look forward to his messages. She caught herself looking at her phone in the middle of a shift, hoping to see a new message from him. It was a feeling she hadn't felt in a long time, the excitement, the anticipation, the butterflies in her stomach. She felt alive. One evening, it was already December and the streets of Freiburg were decorated for Christmas. Philip suggested that they meet in person. Not just for coffee, but for something special. He told her about an event he was organizing. An exclusive New Year's Eve party on a luxury yacht on Lake Constance. There would be interesting people there, good food, music, and champagne. A perfect start to the new year. "I would be delighted if you could join us," he wrote. "It would be nice to start the new year with someone who understands what it means to start over." Margaret hesitated. A party on a yacht? That wasn't her world. She was a woman who went to bed early, who preferred to read a book rather than be at loud parties, but at the same time the idea appealed to her. When was the last time she'd done something unpredictable? When was the last time she had said yes to an adventure without weighing up all the risks? Her ex-husband had often accused her of being too cautious, too boring. Maybe he had been right. Maybe it was time to come out of her shell. She talked to Lena about it when her daughter called her on the phone. Lena sounded skeptical. "Mum, you don't really know this man. You only met him online. Are you sure this is a good idea?" Margaret sensed the concern in her daughter's voice, but she didn't want to let her fear guide her. "I'm almost 50, Lena. I can take care of myself. And besides, it's a public event with lots of people. What could possibly happen?" Lena sighed on the other end of the line. "Okay, but please be careful. And text me when you get there." Margaret agreed with Philip. She bought a new dress, something elegant, but not too flashy. She had her hair done and invested in some subtle makeup. When she looked at herself in the mirror on New Year's Eve, she hardly recognized the woman staring back at her. She looked younger, more alive. It was as if she had taken off a mask she had been wearing for years. She felt beautiful. She felt ready. The drive to Lake Constance took several hours. Margaret drove her own car, which gave her a feeling of control. She could drive home at any time if she felt uncomfortable. Philippe had sent her the exact address of the harbour where the yacht would dock. When she arrived, it was already dark. The harbour was quiet, with only a few people around. The yacht was moored at the end of the pier, lit up like a floating palace. Margaret paused for a moment and looked at the ship. It was bigger than she had expected, elegant and expensive looking. She wondered what kind of world she had just landed in. Philippe was waiting for her at the entrance to the yacht. He looked just like his photos, maybe even better. He was wearing a dark suit and smiled when he saw her. "Margaret, you look beautiful," he said, offering her his hand to help her on board. His hand was warm and firm. She felt safe. "Thank you for coming. I'm really glad to finally meet you in person." His voice was pleasant, deep and soothing. Margaret relaxed a little. There was already a lively atmosphere on board. People in elegant clothes were chatting, laughing and drinking champagne. A band played soft jazz music in the background. Margaret felt out of place at first, but Philippe stayed by her side, introduced her to some of the guests, and made sure she felt comfortable. The other guests were friendly, if a little distant. Most were younger than Margaret, many accompanied by partners. She noticed that she was one of the few older women, but Philippe didn't seem to mind. On the contrary, he made her feel special. The evening was pleasant, the food was exquisite, the champagne flowed freely. Margaret drank more than she normally did. She felt light, elated. Philippe was charming and attentive. He told stories of his travels, of exotic places and exciting encounters. Margaret listened spellbound. It was as if he were opening a door to a world she had previously only known from books. She laughed, she danced, she forgot the time. It was as if she were no longer the sensible nurse from Freiburg, but someone else, someone who dared to live. Around midnight, as fireworks exploded over the lake and people cheered, Margareta stood at the railing and watched the play of colours in the sky. Philip stepped beside her. "A new year," he said quietly. "New possibilities." Margaret nodded. She felt euphoric, full of hope. Maybe this was indeed the beginning of something new. Maybe she had finally found the courage to take control of her life again. Philip put his hand on her shoulder, a seemingly harmless gesture. But at that moment, something changed. His touch suddenly felt heavier, possessive. Margaret turned to him, but his smile was unchanged. "Come with me," he said, pointing toward a door that led to the lower decks. "There's a quieter area down there. We can talk better there." Margaret hesitated. The music had grown louder, the crowd denser. Part of her wanted to stay where it was safe and public, but another part, the part that craved adventure tonight, nodded. "All right," she said. She followed him down the stairs, away from the noise, away from the lights. The corridor was narrow and dimly lit. Margaret felt her pulse quicken, not from excitement, but from a feeling she couldn't name. Something wasn't right. When they reached a door, Philip opened it and stepped aside to let her enter. The room behind it was small, with leather sofas and subdued lighting. Margaret stepped inside, and at that moment she heard footsteps behind her. She turned around and saw several men coming down the corridor. She recognized some of them from the party upstairs. Her heart began to race. "Philippe, what is this?" she asked, her voice trembling. He smiled, but it was no longer the warm smile from earlier. It was cold, calculating. "Relax, Margarete," he said quietly. "We just want to have some fun." The door closed behind her, and Margaret realized with icy clarity that she had made a terrible mistake. The door slammed shut, and the sound echoed in Margaret's ears like a final judgment. The room, which had seemed cozy just a moment ago, turned into a cage. The men who had entered filled the small room with their presence. There were 5, maybe 6. Margaret couldn't see clearly in the dim light. Her mind raced, trying to comprehend what was happening. "Philip, I don't understand," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "What's going on?" He now stood between her and the door, his arms crossed. His expression had completely changed. The warmth she had felt all evening had disappeared. Instead, she saw coldness in his eyes, a frightening indifference. "You came here because you wanted to experience something new, didn't you?" he said slowly. "You wrote to me that your life had become boring, that you wanted to feel alive." Margaret backed away until her back touched the wall. "I didn't mean it that way. Please let me go." One of the men laughed softly. It was a cold, unpleasant sound. Margaret recognized him from upstairs. He had poured her champagne and chatted politely with her. Now he stood there with an expression on his face that frightened her. "They're always like this," he said to Philip, as if Margaret weren't in the room. "First they want excitement, then they get cold feet." Margaret reached for her cell phone in her purse, but Philip was faster. He snatched the bag from her hand and threw it aside. "You won't need that," he said. Margaret felt panic rising inside her. Her heart was pounding so loudly that she was sure the others could hear it. "Please," she whispered, "I have a daughter. She's waiting for me to call her. If I don't, she'll call the police." Philippe smiled. "Your daughter lives in Munich. She'll think you're just having fun and forgot to call. No one will look for you until tomorrow morning, and by then we'll be long gone." The words hit Margaret like blows. He had planned everything, every detail. The weeks of conversation, the trust he had built up. It had all been a means to an end. The men were getting closer. Margaret pressed herself against the wall, desperately searching for a way out. But there was none. The room was small, the door locked. Above her, she could hear the muffled music from the party, the laughter of the other guests. No one knew what was happening down here. No one would help her. She tried to scream, but a hand covered her mouth, pressing down hard. She could hardly breathe. What happened next would be burned into Margaret's memory forever. Not as a clear memory, but as fragmented images, sensations, pain. She fought as best she could, but she was one against many. Her strength was quickly fading. At some point, she stopped fighting, not because she gave up, but because her body couldn't take it anymore. She withdrew into herself, trying not to be there, not to feel, not to exist. The hours merged into endless torment. When it was finally over, Margaret lay motionless on the floor. Her dress was torn, her body ached in places she didn't know could feel pain. She heard the men talking quietly to each other, as if they were discussing the weather. Then they left the room, one after the other. The door closed again, and Margaret was alone. She didn't know how long she lay there. Minutes, hours. Time had lost its meaning. Eventually, she found the strength to sit up. Every movement was agony. She felt around for her handbag and found it in a corner. Her cell phone was broken, the screen shattered, useless. She tried to stand up, but her legs gave way. On her second attempt, she managed to pull herself up against the wall. The yacht rocked gently. Margaret could hear the water lapping against the hull. She had to get out of here. She had to find help. With trembling hands, she opened the door and stepped into the corridor. It was empty, silent. The party upstairs was obviously over. Margaret dragged herself up the stairs. Every step took an infinite amount of effort. When Margaret reached the upper deck, the cold night air hit her like a blow. The sky was still dark, but a faint grey was appearing on the horizon. Dawn was approaching. The yacht lay calmly in the water, far from the shore. Margaret could see the lights of the city in the distance, as unreachable as stars. The deck was deserted. The remains of the party were scattered everywhere. Empty champagne bottles, crumpled napkins, overturned glasses. The garlands swayed in the wind. It was as if nothing had happened, as if the world had simply continued to turn, while Margaret's life had been shattered into pieces. She stumbled to the railing and clung to it. Her hands were shaking so badly that she could barely hold on. The pain in her body was overwhelming. Her mouth felt swollen, her lips were split. She could taste the metallic taste of blood. Every breath hurt. Margaret knew she was badly injured, but she couldn't give up. Not now. She had to find a way to get off this ship. She looked around, searching for a lifeboat, a radio, anything, but the yacht was large, and in her condition she could barely walk more than a few steps without collapsing. Her thoughts were confused, muddled by shock and pain. Lena. She had to think of Lena. Her daughter was waiting for a message. Would she be worried? Would she call the police? Suddenly, Margaret heard footsteps behind her. She spun around too quickly. Her head spun. Black spots danced before her eyes. It was a man, but not Philip or any of the others. He was older, wearing a uniform, a crew member. His face paled when he saw her. "My God," he whispered. "What happened to you?" Margaret wanted to answer, but her voice failed her. She could only shake her head. The man came closer, raising his hands defensively to show he was not a threat. "I'll get help. Stay here." He turned and disappeared toward the bridge. Margaret sank to her knees. The relief that someone had found her was overwhelming. Tears ran down her face, but she didn't have the strength to cry. She could only sit there and hope that help would arrive in time. Minutes passed like hours. Then she heard voices, hurried footsteps. The man returned, this time accompanied by the captain. The captain, a grey-bearded man in his late 50s, knelt down next to Margaret. His eyes were full of compassion and horror. "We'll call the Coast Guard right away," he said. "They'll take you to the hospital. Can you tell me who did this to you?" Margaret opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. Her head felt heavy, her vision blurred. "Philippe," she whispered finally. "Philippe Hartmann, and the other men." The captain frowned. "There is no passenger with that name on my list," he said quietly. Margaret stared at him. Of course not. Of course he had used a false name. It had all been a lie. Every word, every gesture. The captain carefully placed a blanket around her shoulders. "It's okay. The police will sort it out. Right now, you need medical attention." The Coast Guard arrived 20 minutes later. Margaret was carefully placed on a stretcher and taken to the lifeboat. The trip to shore was short, but every wave that cut through the boat sent new waves of pain through her body. An ambulance was already waiting at the harbour. Paramedics took care of her, asking questions she could barely answer. Everything blurred together. At the hospital, Margaret was immediately taken to the emergency room. Doctors and nurses surrounded her, examined her, documented her injuries. Margaret heard fragments of words: severe trauma, internal bleeding, surgery necessary. She understood the words, but she felt detached from them, as if they were talking about someone else. A nurse held her hand. "You're safe now," she said gently. Margaret wanted to believe her, but safety felt like a concept from another life. The examinations took hours. Margaret was photographed, palpated, questioned. A police officer came and asked questions, took notes. She told him everything she could remember. Philip Hartman, the dating app, the yacht on Lake Constance, the men. The police officer listened attentively, his face remaining professionally neutral, but Margarete saw the tension in his shoulders. "We will do everything we can to find these men," he assured her. "The yacht has already been seized. We are gathering evidence." Margarete nodded weakly. Evidence. As if evidence could undo what had happened. As if evidence could ease the pain pulsing through her body. Then came the moment Margarete had feared. A nurse brought her cell phone. It had been repaired and was working. "Would you like to call someone?" she asked cautiously. Margarete stared at the device. Lena. She had to call Lena. But how could she explain what had happened? How could she find the words for something so unspeakable? With trembling fingers, she dialed her daughter's number. The dial tone sounded 3 times before Lena picked up. Her voice sounded sleepy but immediately concerned. "Mom, is everything okay? It's the middle of the night." Margarete opened her mouth but no words came out. How could she begin? How could she tell her daughter that her world had been shattered in a single night? "Mom, are you there?" Lena's voice became more urgent. Margarete took a deep breath, ignoring the sharp pain in her chest. "Lena, I'm in the hospital," she finally managed to say. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, brittle and thin. "In Constance, you have to come." The silence on the other end was oppressive. Then, "What happened? Did you have an accident?" Margarete closed her eyes. "No, not an accident. Please, just come. I'll explain everything when you get here." She heard Lena moving around frantically. "I'll be there in 3 hours. Mum, please tell me you're okay." Margarete couldn't answer. She ended the call. The hours until Lena's arrival passed in a fog of medical examinations and police questioning. A specialist in sexual offences arrived, a woman in her mid-40s with a gentle voice and alert eyes. She explained the procedure to Margarete, the preservation of evidence, the legal steps. Margarete nodded mechanically to everything. Her mind had separated from her body, a protective mechanism against the incomprehensible. When Lena finally arrived, pale and with tear-stained eyes, something broke inside Margarete. Her daughter rushed to her bed and hugged her gently, as if she might break. "What did they do to you?" Lena whispered, her voice choked with tears. Margarete told her everything, every horrible detail. Lena cried, held her hand, and cried. "We'll find them," Lena finally said, her voice suddenly hard with determination. "Every single one of them." She took out her own cell phone and typed a message. "I'm calling Tobias. He needs to know." Margarete frowned. "Tobias?" Lena nodded. "My fiancé. I told you about him. He's a detective in Munich." Margarete vaguely remembered. Lena had told her about a new man in her life a few months ago, but Margarete had been so immersed in her own loneliness that she had hardly listened. Now she felt guilty. Her daughter had been living her life while Margarete was wallowing in self-pity, and it was precisely this loneliness that had made her vulnerable. Tobias Meyer arrived the next morning. He was in his early 30s, tall, with the calm, focused gaze of a man accustomed to seeing tragedy. He greeted Margarete respectfully and took the time to talk to her. "Ms. Wolf, I promise you we will do everything we can to bring these men to justice," he said. His voice was firm and confident. Tobias got to work immediately. He coordinated with the local police and requested all available evidence. The yacht had been seized, but the passenger list was fake. The names were all false, the addresses made up. It was as if the men had never existed. But Tobias didn't give up. He was like a bloodhound that had picked up a scent. "There are always traces," he explained to Lena and Margarete. "Digital footprints, financial transactions, surveillance cameras. These men may have been well prepared, but no one is perfect." He analyzed Margaret's dating profile, the messages she had exchanged with the man who called himself Philip Hartmann. The IP address led to an internet cafe in Stuttgart. Another dead end. But then Tobias found something. A surveillance camera at the harbor in Constance had recorded the guests arriving on the yacht. Tobias spent hours reviewing the footage, enlarging faces, comparing them with databases. And then he had a hit. One of the men was known to the police, not for sex crimes, but for fraud. His name was Martin Kessler, 32 years old, residing in Hamburg. "That's our lead," said Tobias. The police in Hamburg were informed. Kessler's apartment was searched. What they found there took even experienced investigators' breath away. A laptop full of photos and videos, not only of Margaret, but of other women. Dozens, all older, all in similar situations. The yacht, the party, the trap. "This isn't the first time," Tobias said to Lena, his face grim. "This is a pattern, a system." He showed her the files, and Lena had to look away. The women's faces, their fear, their pain. How many had remained silent? How many had been too ashamed to go to the police? Margaret was perhaps the first to survive and speak out. Through Kessler, the investigators found the others. Names, addresses, connections. It was a network that had been built up over years. Men from different cities, different professions, but united by a vile preference. They hunted women who were lonely, vulnerable. They had perfected a system of gaining their trust and then luring them into a trap. The arrests were coordinated. In Hamburg, Stuttgart, Frankfurt, Munich, a total of 9 men were arrested. The man who had called himself Philip Hartmann was actually named Daniel Bruckner, a 40-year-old businessman from Düsseldorf. He had a wife and 2 children, a respectable life. No one would have believed what he did in his spare time. The news spread quickly. The media pounced on the case. "Yacht horror on Lake Constance," the newspapers headlined. Margaret's name was not mentioned, but her story was everywhere. And then something unexpected happened. Other women came forward, one after another. They had remained silent out of shame, out of fear. But now that someone had spoken up, they too found their courage. The courtroom in Constance was filled to capacity on that spring morning. Journalists, relatives, onlookers, everyone wanted to witness 9 men being held accountable for their crimes. Margaret sat in the front row, Lena on one side, Tobias on the other. Her hands trembled slightly, even though she had them clasped tightly in her lap. 3 months had passed since that night. 3 months full of nightmares, therapy sessions, and endless police interrogations. Margaret had cried more during that time than she ever thought possible. But she had also discovered a strength within herself that she didn't know existed. She would not remain silent. She would look these men in the face and tell the truth. The defendants were led in. Margaret forced herself to look. Daniel Bruckner, who had introduced himself to her as Philip Hartmann, was the first to enter. He wore an expensive suit, and his hair was neatly combed. He looked like a successful businessman, not a monster. Margaret felt her stomach tighten. Martin Kessler followed him, then the others. 7 more faces she would never forget. The presiding judge, a man in his late 60s with grey temples and a stern gaze, opened the trial. The indictment was read out. Aggravated sexual assault, rape in a particularly serious case, grievous bodily harm. The list of charges seemed endless. Margaret listened, each word stabbing at a wound that had not yet healed. The defendants' lawyers tried to relativize the crimes. They spoke of consensual encounters, misunderstandings, women who changed their minds after the fact. Margaret clenched her hands into fists. How dare they? But Tobias had prepared her. "They'll try to discredit you," he had said. "That's their job, but the evidence speaks for itself." And the evidence was overwhelming. The videos on Kessler's laptop, the DNA traces, the statements of other victims. A total of 16 women had come forward. 16 women whose lives had been destroyed by these men. Some of them were present in the courtroom, others had submitted written statements. Every single story was similar to Margaret's. The dating app, the trust, the yacht, the betrayal. When Margaret was called to the witness stand, she felt her legs go weak. Lena squeezed her hand briefly. "You can do this," she whispered. Margaret stood up and walked forward. She took the oath, her voice surprisingly steady. Then she began to tell her story. Not just about that night, but about everything that came after. The shame, the guilt, the nightmares, the shattered security. "I thought it was my fault," she said, her voice breaking. "I thought I should have been more careful. I thought I should have recognized the signs." She looked over at Daniel Bruckner. He avoided her gaze. "But the fault doesn't lie with me. The fault lies with them. They took advantage of my loneliness. They abused my trust. They took something from me that I will never get back." The defense attorneys tried to trip her up with contradictions. Why had she gone onto the yacht? Why had she drunk so much? Why had she followed Bruckner to the lower deck? Margaret remained calm. "Because I trusted him," she replied again and again. "Because I believed he was a good person. That doesn't make me guilty. That makes them the perpetrators." After 4 days of trial, the verdict was handed down. The courtroom was silent as the judge began to speak. Over many years, the defendants developed a perfidious system to lure women into a trap and then abuse them in the most severe manner. They specifically selected their victims, women who were lonely, who were looking for connection, who were vulnerable. They gained their trust only to break it in the most cruel way. He paused, letting his gaze wander over the defendants. "The court has reached the conclusion that the defendants are guilty on all counts." A murmur went through the courtroom. Margaret felt tears welling up in her eyes, but this time they were tears of relief. Daniel Bruckner is sentenced to 13 years in prison, Martin Kessler to 12 years. The sentences for the others followed. None of them got less than 10 years. Margaret left the courtroom in a daze. Journalists were waiting outside, but Tobias shielded her from them. Lena led her mother to a waiting car. "It's over," Lena said, her voice full of emotion. "It's really over." Margaret nodded, but she knew it wasn't really over. The men might be in prison, but the scars they had left behind would remain. Nevertheless, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. She had survived. She had spoken out. She had not let shame and fear defeat her. And maybe, just maybe, she had shown other women that they were not alone, that their voices were being heard, that justice was possible. A year had passed since the verdict. Margarete stood at her kitchen window in Freiburg and watched the rain tapping gently against the pane. It was November, just like when it all began. But this time, the rain felt different. Not oppressive, but cleansing. The apartment had changed. Lena had helped her redecorate, lighter colors, new furniture, an attempt to dispel the shadows. There was a letter on the kitchen table. Margaret had received it that morning. It was from one of the other women who had testified. She wrote that she could finally sleep again, that the verdict had helped her find closure. She thanked Margaret for having the courage to be the first to speak out. Margaret put the letter aside and took a deep breath. The therapy had helped, not to forget, that would never happen, but to learn to live with the memories. Her therapist, Dr. Weber, had explained to her that healing was not a goal to be achieved, but a path to be walked. Some days were easier than others. She had resumed her work at the hospital, initially only part-time. Her colleagues had been supportive, cautious, but not pitying. Margaret had appreciated that. She didn't want pity. She wanted her life back. Slowly, step by step, she began to feel that this was possible. Her relationship with Lena had changed fundamentally. The distance that had stood between them for years had disappeared. Lena now visited her regularly, and they talked for hours about everything. About the trauma, but also about normal things. About Lena's wedding plans with Tobias. About Margaret's desire to perhaps travel again when she was ready. "You're stronger than you think, Mom," Lena had told her recently. Margaret had smiled. "I had no choice. Be strong or break." Lena had shaken her head. "Yes, you had a choice. Many women wouldn't have dared to speak up. You did. That makes you a hero." Margaret didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a survivor. But maybe that was enough. An organization that supported victims of sexual violence had contacted her. They asked if she would be willing to share her story publicly. Not in the media, but with support groups, to show other women that they were not alone. Margaret had agreed. At her first meeting, she sat in front of 20 women of different ages. They all had their own stories, their own wounds. Margaret told them about that night, about the fear, about the shame. But she also told them about the moment when she decided to fight, about her decision not to sink into silence. "You are not guilty," she told the women. "No matter what anyone has told you, no matter what you think yourself, the guilt always lies with the perpetrator. Always." Several women cried, others nodded. An older woman approached Margaret after the meeting. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for showing us that it is possible." Margaret had deleted the dating app, of course, but she hadn't stopped hoping that there were good people out there, people who deserved trust. She had become more cautious, more vigilant, but she hadn't stopped living. That would have been the perpetrator's ultimate victory. Some evenings, when the loneliness became too much, she called her therapist. Dr. Weber had given her her private number for emergencies. "It's okay to need help," she had said. "It's okay not to be strong every day." Paradoxically, this permission to be weak had made Margaret stronger. She often thought of the other victims, the 16 women who had come forward, the unknown number of those who had remained silent. The police suspected there were more. Women who would never find the courage to speak out, women who would take their shame to their graves. That hurt Margaret the most. But she could only do what was in her power. She could tell her story. She could encourage others. She could show that justice was possible, even if it remained imperfect. The men were in prison, but the wounds they had inflicted were healing slowly. Margaret took a cup of tea and sat down by the window. The rain had stopped. A strip of sunlight broke through the clouds. It was only a brief moment, but it felt significant. A sign, perhaps, or just a beautiful moment. She thought of the woman she had been a year ago, the lonely nurse who was looking for connection, for life, for adventure. That woman no longer existed. In her place was someone else, someone who had been broken and had put herself back together again. The cracks were visible, but they didn't make her weaker. They made her human. Margaret's cell phone rang. It was Lena. "Mom, are you free tonight? Tobias and I would like to come over. We have a surprise for you." Margaret smiled. "Of course. I'd love to." She ended the call and looked out the window again. The sun was shining brighter now. Life went on. Not like before, but on, and maybe that was enough.